Judge mocks black woman in court, shocked to learn she's a genius attorney in disguise. The judge leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips as he addressed the modestly dressed black woman standing before him. His voice dripped with condescension as he questioned her every word, the room quietly echoing with stifled chuckles from the gallery. To them, she was just another defendant, unimportant, out of her depth, and easy to dismiss. But what no one realized was that she wasn't who they thought she was. Beneath her calm exterior lay a brilliant mind, a secret she'd kept hidden for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, it would leave the courtroom and the judge reeling. Who was this woman? And what would she reveal that would turn the entire case on its head? Stay with me, because this is one story you won't want to miss. The Cook County Courthouse was bustling that morning, its wide marble halls echoing with the sounds of hurried footsteps and murmured conversations. The heavy oak doors to courtroom 3B creaked open, allowing in a diverse crowd of litigants, lawyers, and spectators. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and tension. For most people, it was just another day, but for Angela Monroe, it was a pivotal moment she had been preparing for meticulously. Angela stepped inside quietly, dressed in a simple navy blue suit that had seen better days. Her dark curls framed a calm yet determined face, and she clutched a worn leather briefcase with both hands, as if anchoring herself in the room's charged atmosphere. She moved toward the defense table, her footsteps soft but purposeful on the tiled floor. Around her, eyes flickered with curiosity, and in some cases, dismissal. "Next case," boomed the voice of Judge Edward Sinclair. The judge sat elevated behind the imposing bench, his black robes pristine, his glasses perched low on his nose. Sinclair was a man accustomed to authority, and his demeanor made it clear he enjoyed every ounce of it. His reputation for being sharp-tongued and occasionally abrasive preceded him, though few dared to challenge his temperament. Angela's case was called. She straightened her back and approached the bench with quiet confidence. As she did, she noticed the judge's sharp blue eyes sweep over her. A fleeting expression of disapproval crossed his face, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by most, but Angela caught it. "Miss Monroe," Judge Sinclair began, dragging out her name with exaggerated formality. "You're representing yourself today, I see." "Yes, Your Honor," Angela replied, her voice steady and respectful. Sinclair leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as a condescending smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Very well. This should be interesting." The courtroom chuckled lightly at his tone, and Angela's jaw tightened. She remained silent, refusing to rise to the bait. The plaintiff's attorney, a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and an overly confident air, stood to present his case. He wore an expensive gray suit that seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to Angela's understated attire. His voice was polished, almost rehearsed, as he outlined his client's grievances. Angela listened intently, her face unreadable. She occasionally jotted notes in a small notebook, her handwriting precise and neat. Every now and then, her eyes flicked up to meet the judge's, holding his gaze for a moment before returning to her work. It wasn't defiance, it was quiet determination. When it was Angela's turn, she rose and adjusted her papers, her movements deliberate and calm. The room seemed as still as she began to speak. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's argument rests on several misrepresentations of fact, which I will address in due course," she said. Her voice was firm but measured, carrying a subtle authority that made people lean forward to listen. "First, I would like to draw the court's attention to—" "Miss Monroe," Judge Sinclair interrupted, holding up a hand. "I trust you're aware this isn't a classroom lecture. Keep it concise." Angela paused, her expression unchanging. "Of course, Your Honor. I was simply laying the foundation for my argument." Sinclair waved her on dismissively. "Proceed. But let's not get lost in the weeds, shall we?" The courtroom chuckled again, louder this time. Angela inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She had faced moments like this before, moments when prejudice was cloaked in professionalism, when her capabilities were dismissed before she had even spoken. But today, she would not be deterred. As Angela continued, She began to weave a meticulous argument, pointing out flaws in the plaintiff's evidence with quiet precision. Her tone was patient, almost surgical, as she dissected their claims. Opposing counsel has referred to Exhibit B as conclusive proof of ownership, she said, holding up a copy of the document. However, if we examine the title closely, we see discrepancies in the signature dates, which suggest— "Objection, Your Honor," the plaintiff's attorney interrupted, his voice edged with annoyance. "She's speculating. I am merely pointing out inconsistencies in the evidence presented," Angela replied, her tone unflappable. She turned to Judge Sinclair. "Your Honor, I would like to request that Exhibit B be examined for authenticity." The judge sighed audibly, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Miss Monroe, this is not the time to play detective. Stick to the facts." "With respect, Your Honor," Angela said, her voice unwavering, "authenticity is a fact, and it's relevant to the case." The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the soft scratch of the judge's pen against his notes. Sinclair's jaw tightened, and he narrowed his eyes at Angela, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so directly. "Fine," he said at last, his tone clipped. "But make it quick." As the morning progressed, Angela's confidence began to shift the energy in the room. The opposing attorney stumbled over his responses to her pointed questions, and the judge's attempts to undermine her were becoming less effective. Still, Judge Sinclair clung to his condescension, masking his growing unease. "Miss Monroe," he said during a brief recess, "you're remarkably thorough for someone untrained in the law." Angela met his gaze evenly. "I've spent considerable time studying it, Your Honor." "Well, studying isn't the same as practicing," he quipped, leaning back in his chair. "But I suppose you'll learn that soon enough." Angela said nothing, but the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. Let him think what he wanted. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. The courtroom settled once again after the recess, a wave of murmurs fading as Judge Sinclair banged his gavel. Angela Monroe sat back at the defense table, flipping through her meticulously organized files. Her fingers moved with precision, selecting a document here, a highlighted note there, her face calm but focused. Across the room, the plaintiff's attorney, Howard Tremont, stood with a smug grin. He glanced at Angela as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience, a minor obstacle in his well-oiled legal routine. His confidence radiated with every step he took back to his seat, the faint gleam of his Rolex catching the light. Judge Sinclair adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "All right, let's get back to it. Mr. Tremont, you may continue with your witness." Tremont called his first witness, a property manager named Martin Hollis, whose testimony was meant to solidify the plaintiff's claim of ownership. Hollis was an older man, his gray suit ill-fitting and his manner nervous. Tremont's questions were straightforward, carefully designed to paint a picture of an indisputable case. "Mr. Hollis," Tremont began, pacing slowly, "can you confirm that you've managed the property in question for the past 10 years? "Yes," Hollis replied, his voice shaky but audible. "And during that time, have you ever seen the defendant, Miss Monroe, make any claims to the property?" Hollis glanced at Angela, his brow furrowed. "No, I haven't." Tremont smiled triumphantly, turning back to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Angela leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes were sharp, watching Hollis closely as he prepared to step down. "Miss Monroe," Judge Sinclair said with a raised brow, "your witness should you choose to cross-examine." Angela rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She approached the witness stand with a measured pace, her heels clicking softly against the tile. There was no trace of hesitation as she positioned herself in front of Hollis, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. "Mr. Hollis," she began, her tone polite but firm, "you stated that you've managed the property in question for 10 years. Is that correct?" "Yes," he answered. "And during that time, would you say you've had full access to the property's legal and financial records?" Hollis hesitated, glancing at Tremont before nodding. Yes, I would. Angela's lips curved into a faint smile. Then you must be familiar with this document. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, holding it up for the courtroom to see. This is the original deed of sale for the property, dated 15 years ago. Do you recognize the signature at the bottom? Hollis squinted at the paper, his nervousness growing. It looks like the plaintiff's signature. Angela stepped closer, her voice soft but insistent. And are you aware that this signature does not match the plaintiff's signature on subsequent documents, including Exhibit B, which your attorney introduced earlier? The room grew tense. Hollis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I hadn't noticed. Angela turned to the judge, her tone unwavering. Your Honor, I would like to submit this document as evidence of forgery. Judge Sinclair leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the document Angela had handed to the bailiff. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the courtroom was silent save for the rustle of papers. Miss Monroe, Sinclair said finally, his tone clipped. This is quite the accusation. Do you have expert testimony to support your claim? I do, Your Honor, Angela replied calmly. I've consulted a handwriting expert who has verified that the signatures on the documents are not consistent. Their report is included in the appendix of my filings. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, and he glanced at Tremont, whose confident demeanor was beginning to crack. Mr. Tremont, do you have a response to this? Tremont stood abruptly, his expression a mixture of annoyance and alarm. Your Honor, this is clearly a delay tactic. The defendant is grasping at straws. Angela's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Or perhaps, Your Honor, the plaintiff is grasping at stolen property. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Sinclair slammed his gavel to restore order. His gaze fell on Angela, a spark of irritation mingled with something else. Respect, curiosity. It was hard to tell. Miss Monroe, he said sternly, you're walking a fine line. I'll allow this evidence, but tread carefully. This is still a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Angela inclined her head. Understood, Your Honor. As the trial continued, Angela's cross-examinations grew sharper, her questions more incisive. She called into question not only the validity of the plaintiff's claims, but the integrity of their evidence. Witnesses faltered under her scrutiny, their rehearsed answers unraveling with each pointed question. Meanwhile, Judge Sinclair's demeanor shifted subtly. Though he continued to interrupt Angela and occasionally dismiss her arguments, there was a tension in his tone that hadn't been there before. He was beginning to realize that Angela was not the naive, overconfident amateur he had assumed. By the time the court adjourned for the day, the room was buzzing with murmurs. Spectators whispered about the unexpected turn of events, and even Tremont avoided Angela's gaze as he gathered his papers. Angela packed her briefcase slowly, her movements unhurried despite the day's intensity. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt the weight of every stare, every whispered word. She didn't look back. This was far from over, and tomorrow she planned to turn the tide even further. The next morning, the Cook County Courthouse was abuzz with anticipation. Word of the dramatic revelations in Courtroom 3B had spread, drawing curious onlookers and even a few reporters eager to catch the unfolding drama. Angela Monroe arrived early, her modest attire and calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the energy swirling around her. She stepped into the courtroom, her worn leather briefcase still clutched firmly in hand. The plaintiff's attorney, Howard Tremont, was already at his table, his normally confident smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. Tremont glanced at Angela briefly, his expression tight, before leaning over to whisper furiously to his assistant. Angela noticed but showed no reaction. She walked to her seat, placed her briefcase on the table, and began reviewing her notes with quiet focus. Judge Edward Sinclair entered the room shortly after, his black robes flowing as he took his seat at the bench. His expression was unreadable, but there was a slight tension in his movements, as if the events of the previous day had left their mark. He banged his gavel once, and the courtroom fell silent. "Let's proceed," he said curtly. His voice carried less of the overt condescension that had colored his tone the day before. It was subtle, but Angela noticed. Perhaps he was beginning to realize this case wasn't as straightforward as he had assumed. The morning's proceedings began with the continuation of Angela's cross-examination of the plaintiff's witnesses. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled, and approached the stand where Martin Hollis, the property manager, had been called back for additional testimony. "Mr. Hollis," Angela began, her tone measured, "yesterday you testified that you had never seen me make any claims to the property in question. Is that correct?" "Yes," Hollis replied cautiously. "And yet you admitted that you were unaware of the discrepancies in the property's title documents. Is that also correct?" Hollis hesitated. "Yes, I suppose that's true." Angela walked slowly to the evidence table, picking up a folder. "Mr. Hollis, as the property manager, are you responsible for maintaining accurate records for the property?" "Yes," he said, his voice quieter now. "Then can you explain why the tax receipts for this property, dating back 5 years, are in my name?" Angela opened the folder and held up a series of documents for the courtroom to see. "These are official records from the Cook County Treasurer's Office. I have personally paid the property taxes every year since 2017. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Hollis's face turned pale as he glanced nervously at Tremont, who was furiously scribbling notes. Angela pressed on, her voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Hollis, would you agree that paying property taxes is an indication of ownership?" I guess so," he stammered. Angela turned to Judge Sinclair, her expression composed. "Your Honor, I move to strike Mr. Hollis's testimony as unreliable and request that the court consider the tax receipts as evidence of my ownership." Sinclair leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents before him. "The motion is granted," he said reluctantly. "The tax receipts will be admitted as evidence." Tremont rose from his seat, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tinged with irritation, "the defendant's evidence, while compelling on the surface, does not address the core issue of the property deed's authenticity. Without expert testimony, her claims are purely speculative." Angela turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Mr. Tremont, I believe the handwriting analysis I submitted yesterday speaks directly to the deed's authenticity. Perhaps you'd like to explain why the plaintiff's signature appears to change between documents." The courtroom fell silent. Tremont's jaw tightened, and a bead of sweat formed on his temple. "Your Honor," he said, his voice louder now, "the defendant is attempting to distract from the facts of the case. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to shift the burden of proof." Angela didn't flinch. "Desperation, Mr. Tremont, is resorting to forged documents to claim ownership of something that doesn't belong to you." Gasps rippled through the room, and Judge Sinclair slammed his gavel. "Order!" he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. He turned his sharp gaze to Angela. "Miss Monroe, you will refrain from making accusations without concrete evidence." Angela nodded. "Understood, Your Honor. I will let the evidence speak for itself." As the proceedings continued, Angela's calm, methodical approach began to unsettle not just Tremont, but also Judge Sinclair. Though he tried to maintain his usual commanding presence, cracks were starting to show. He interrupted Angela less frequently, and when he did, his tone lacked the sharp edge it had carried the day before. Sinclair's unease grew as Angela introduced more evidence. Emails between the plaintiff and a third party discussing the potential resale of the property, financial records showing unexplained deposits into the plaintiff's account shortly after the alleged purchase, and even a sworn affidavit from a neighbor who had witnessed Angela maintaining the property for years. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in the coffin of the plaintiff's case, and with every revelation, Tremont's confidence eroded further. By midday, the energy in the room had shifted. The spectators, who had initially dismissed Angela as an overconfident amateur, now watched her with growing respect. Even the court stenographer seemed to sit up straighter, her fingers flying across the keyboard as Angela spoke. During a short recess, Angela returned to her seat and began reviewing her notes again. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but refused to acknowledge them. This case wasn't about winning over the crowd. It was about the truth. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Judge Sinclair watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something she hadn't seen before: curiosity. Angela allowed herself the faintest smile. Let him wonder. The real revelations were still to come. The third day of the trial began with a heavy stillness in courtroom 3B, as though the air itself braced for the storm that Angela Monroe was about to unleash. The crowd was larger than ever, with curious faces filling the gallery, eager to witness what many had begun to call a David versus Goliath battle. Angela arrived early, her demeanor as composed as ever, though there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that spoke volumes. She settled at the defense table, placing her briefcase on the polished wood surface with care. Today, she knew, would be pivotal. It wasn't enough to cast doubt on the plaintiff's claims. She needed to dismantle their case entirely. To do so, she had to wield her evidence with precision, much like a surgeon with a scalpel. Across the room, Howard Tremont shuffled his papers, his movements brisk and tense. He wore a darker suit today, as though trying to project an air of gravity, but the unease in his expression betrayed him. Judge Edward Sinclair entered shortly after, his gavel striking sharply against the bench. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice clipped. His usual arrogance had dimmed, replaced by a wary professionalism. He glanced briefly at Angela before turning his attention to Tremont. "Mr. Tremont, you may call your next witness." Tremont called his final witness, a handwriting analyst named Dr. William Harding, who had been hastily added to the plaintiff's roster. It was a clear attempt to counter Angela's evidence regarding the alleged forgery. Dr. Harding was an older man with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of practiced authority. He walked to the stand with measured steps, adjusting his tie before taking his seat. Tremont wasted no time. "Dr. Harding," Tremont began, his voice steady, "you've reviewed the documents in question, including the deed submitted by my client. Can you confirm the authenticity of my client's signature?" Dr. Harding nodded confidently. "Based on my analysis, the signature on the deed is consistent with other verified samples of the plaintiff's handwriting." Tremont smiled, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, this confirms that the defendant's claims of forgery are unfounded." Angela, who had been silently observing, rose to her feet. "Your Honor, I would like to cross-examine the witness." Judge Sinclair gestured for her to proceed, his expression guarded. Angela walked to the witness stand, her steps deliberate. She carried a folder containing the same documents that had been submitted as evidence, but held something else in her free hand: a magnifying glass. "Dr. Harding," Angela began, her tone polite but firm, "you testified that the signature on the deed is consistent with the plaintiff's handwriting. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "And your analysis was based on visual examination of the documents." "That's correct." Angela nodded, setting her folder on the edge of the witness stand. "Did you use any specialized equipment such as microscopic imaging or chemical analysis to verify the ink's age?" Dr. Harding hesitated for the briefest moment. "No, my analysis did not include those methods." Angela's voice remained calm, but there was a faint edge to her words now. "So, your conclusion is based solely on visual comparison?" "Yes," he admitted. Angela held up the magnifying glass. "Would you be willing to take a closer look at the signature on this document, specifically the ink pattern around the date?" Dr. Harding glanced at Tremont, who gave a small, reluctant nod. Angela handed the document and magnifying glass to the witness. The room was silent as Dr. Harding leaned over, examining the deed closely. "Do you notice anything unusual about the ink around the date?" Angela asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Dr. Harding straightened, his expression uneasy. "There appear to be slight discrepancies. The ink seems newer than the rest of the document." Angela nodded, stepping closer. Would you agree that these discrepancies suggest the date was altered after the document was originally signed? Dr. Harding shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's possible. Angela turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that this document be subjected to forensic ink analysis to determine the age of the date. Judge Sinclair's brow furrowed as he considered her request. Tremont leapt to his feet, his voice tight with frustration. Your Honor, this is yet another delay tactic. The defendant is attempting to undermine credible testimony with baseless speculation. Angela remained unflinching. Your Honor, the discrepancies in this document raise serious questions about its authenticity. If opposing counsel is confident in their case, they should have no objection to verifying the evidence. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, his face a mask of neutrality. I will allow the request for forensic analysis. However, I expect both parties to expedite this process. Tremont sat down heavily, his frustration palpable. Angela returned to her seat, her calm demeanor unbroken. As the court adjourned for lunch, whispers filled the room. Angela's cross-examination had shifted the narrative once again, casting further doubt on the plaintiff's case. Spectators speculated about the implications of the altered date, their curiosity growing with each passing moment. Angela left the courtroom briefly, stepping into the quiet corridor outside. She leaned against the cool marble wall, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The weight of the trial pressed against her, but beneath it all, there was a growing sense of satisfaction. The cracks in the plaintiff's case were widening, and it was only a matter of time before everything crumbled. Back in his chambers, Judge Sinclair sat at his desk, reviewing the day's proceedings. He tapped his pen against the edge of his legal pad, his thoughts racing. Angela Monroe was unlike any defendant he had encountered. She was composed, meticulous, and undeniably intelligent. He had underestimated her. He could admit that now, even if only to himself. There was a part of him that respected her tenacity, though he would never show it in the courtroom. Still, a nagging question lingered in his mind. Who exactly was Angela Monroe? Sinclair set his pen down, his jaw tightening. He needed to maintain control of his courtroom, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the one steering this trial. Returning to the courtroom after lunch, Angela noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The whispers grew quieter as she passed, and a few heads nodded in acknowledgement. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. As she settled back into her seat, Angela glanced briefly at Judge Sinclair. For the first time, she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Hesitation. It was only the beginning. By the end of the trial, she intended to leave no doubt about the truth. The courtroom resumed after lunch, its energy tense and brimming with unspoken anticipation. Angela Monroe sat at the defense table, quietly arranging her notes, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the palpable anxiety emanating from the plaintiff's side. Howard Tremont, the seasoned attorney who had once exuded unshakable confidence, now appeared visibly unsettled. His sharp suit seemed less polished, his movements more abrupt, and his whispers to his assistant more frantic. Judge Edward Sinclair, however, projected a different kind of tension. Seated at his bench, he adjusted his glasses and tapped his gavel to call the room to order. His usual air of authority seemed tinged with something else now, perhaps unease or even curiosity about what Angela might unveil next. "Miss Monroe," Sinclair began, his tone measured. "The floor is yours. Proceed." Angela stood slowly, her every movement deliberate. She walked to the center of the courtroom with a folder in hand, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The gallery fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. "Your Honor," Angela began, her voice calm yet commanding, "I'd like to present additional evidence that further undermines the plaintiff's claims of ownership." Tremont shot up from his seat, his tone sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an ambush. Opposing counsel has not disclosed any new evidence in advance." Angela turned to face the judge, her expression steady. "Your Honor, This evidence is in direct response to the questions raised during the plaintiff's presentation of their case. It's not an ambush. It's the truth. Judge Sinclair raised a hand, silencing Tremont's protest. Overruled. Let's hear it, Miss Monroe. Angela nodded her thanks and continued. This morning we discussed discrepancies in the property deed, particularly the date, which appeared to have been altered. However, there's more. I conducted an independent title search through the Cook County Recorder of Deeds. What I found was illuminating. She handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, who distributed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. Tremont snatched his copy, scanning it quickly, his face darkening with each passing second. This is an official record, Angela explained, turning to address the court. It shows that the property in question was never legally transferred to the plaintiff. The last recorded deed lists the previous owner as Mr. Elijah Monroe, my late father. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the gallery erupted in murmurs. Angela stood tall, her gaze steady and unwavering as she waited for order to be restored. Judge Sinclair banged his gavel. "Order in the court," he barked. Turning to Angela, his expression sharpened. "Miss Monroe, are you claiming that the plaintiff fabricated their ownership entirely?" "Yes, Your Honor," Angela replied, her voice unwavering. "And I intend to prove it." Tremont rose again, his face flushed. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant is attempting to rewrite the narrative with baseless allegations." Angela turned to him, her tone calm but piercing. "The records speak for themselves, Mr. Tremont. If you'd like, I can call a witness from the Recorder of Deeds office to authenticate them." Sinclair leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He motioned for Tremont to sit. "Let's proceed with the evidence," he said, gesturing for Angela to continue. Angela walked to the evidence table and retrieved another document. "Your Honor, this is a letter from the plaintiff to a third party, discussing plans to resell the property for a significant profit. The letter was intercepted and brought to my attention by a concerned individual." She handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Sinclair's brow furrowed as he read. "And this third party, is their identity disclosed in this document?" Angela hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The third party is listed as Midwest Land Holdings, a company known for acquiring properties under dubious circumstances." Tremont stood abruptly, his voice rising. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculative and irrelevant." Sinclair looked up from the document, his expression stern. "Overruled. The relevance is clear. Continue, Miss Monroe." Angela turned back to the gallery. "This letter not only demonstrates the plaintiff's intent to resell the property, but also suggests collusion with entities engaged in fraudulent activities. Combined with the altered deed and the lack of legal transfer, it paints a very troubling picture." As Angela laid out her case, the plaintiff, a middle-aged man named Richard Langston, grew visibly agitated. He shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting nervously. At one point, he leaned over to whisper urgently to Tremont, who brushed him off with a sharp gesture. Angela noticed their exchange but didn't comment. Instead, she continued to present her evidence, each piece a deliberate step toward unraveling their claims. When she finally returned to her seat, the courtroom was silent. All eyes were on Judge Sinclair, who appeared deep in thought as he reviewed the documents before him. Tremont, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. Sinclair leaned forward, folding his hands on the bench. "Mr. Tremont," he said, his voice low but firm, "do you have any explanation for these discrepancies?" Tremont stood, his composure fraying at the edges. "Your Honor, these allegations are baseless. The defendant has provided no concrete proof of fraud." Angela rose again, her tone sharp. "Your Honor, the proof is in the records, the altered deed, and the plaintiff's own correspondence. If the plaintiff believes otherwise, I welcome them to provide evidence to refute it." Sinclair's gaze shifted between Angela and Tremont before finally settling on the latter. "Mr. Tremont, do you have any additional evidence to submit?" Tremont hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No, Your Honor." For the first time, Judge Sinclair's carefully maintained neutrality seemed to waver. He glanced at Angela, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the gallery. "We will reconvene tomorrow," he announced, banging his gavel. "This court is adjourned." The room erupted in whispers as people filed out, their voices buzzing with speculation. Angela remained seated, her hands resting on her briefcase. She didn't rush to leave. Instead, she allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. Today had been a turning point, and the walls were closing in on her opponents. Tomorrow, she would deliver the final blow. The next day, courtroom 3B was filled to capacity. The tension in the air was palpable, thicker than it had been on any previous day. Word of Angela Monroe's methodical dismantling of the plaintiff's case had spread beyond the courthouse walls. Spectators, reporters, and even other attorneys now vied for seats, eager to witness what many were calling a legal spectacle. Angela arrived early, as usual, her modest attire and calm demeanor unchanged. She moved with quiet purpose to the defense table, her leather briefcase once again in hand. Today, it wasn't just filled with documents. It carried the weight of her father's legacy, her own perseverance, and the undeniable truth. Howard Tremont was already seated at the plaintiff's table, his posture rigid, his expression grim. The confident, polished attorney who had laughed at Angela's early arguments was gone, replaced by a man visibly grappling with the unraveling of his case. He barely glanced at Angela as she set down her things, though she felt his discomfort like a tangible presence in the room. Judge Edward Sinclair entered moments later, his black robe sweeping behind him. His gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack, calling the courtroom to order. His expression was harder to read today, neutral, but with an edge of caution, as though he anticipated the day's proceedings might veer into uncharted territory. "We'll begin with the continuation of the defense," Sinclair announced, his tone clipped. "Miss Monroe, you may proceed." Angela rose from her seat, her movements deliberate but unhurried. She carried a single document in her hand, her expression calm but resolute. The room fell silent as she approached the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, over the past few days I have presented evidence that challenges the plaintiff's claim to the property in question. We have seen altered documents, discrepancies in financial records, and questionable correspondence. Today I intend to provide the final piece of the puzzle, a document that unequivocally proves my ownership." She turned to the bailiff, handing him the paper. "This is my father's will, filed with the Cook County Probate Court. It explicitly names me, Angela Monroe, as the sole heir to the property." Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the bailiff handed the document to Judge Sinclair. Tremont's face turned a deep shade of red as he shot out of his seat. "Your Honor, I object." Tremont's voice was louder than necessary, his desperation plain. "This document was not disclosed prior to trial. It's inadmissible." Angela turned to face him, her expression calm but piercing. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's failure to verify the chain of title made it unnecessary to introduce this document earlier. But given the persistent challenges to my claim, it has become relevant." Sinclair held up a hand, silencing Tremont's protests. "Sit down, Mr. Tremont," he ordered. His voice carried a sharp edge that left no room for argument. Tremont sat heavily, glaring at Angela as she continued. Angela walked to the evidence table, her hands resting lightly on its surface. Her voice was steady, measured. "This will establish an unbroken line of ownership, beginning with my father and ending with me. It negates the plaintiff's claim entirely." She turned to face Richard Langston, the plaintiff. "Mr. Langston, you testified on the first day of this trial that you purchased the property directly from my father. Is that correct?" Langston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Tremont for reassurance. "Yes," he muttered. Angela stepped closer, her voice soft but pointed. "Then can you explain why there is no record of such a transaction? No sale agreement, no transfer of title, no tax filings. Nothing to support your claim?" Langston's face flushed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Angela pressed on, her tone growing sharper. "Or perhaps, Mr. Langston, you'd like to explain the correspondence between you and Midwest Land Holdings, in which you discussed plans to resell the property at a significant profit. Were you planning to profit off stolen land? Tremont shot to his feet again. Objection, Your Honor. This is harassment. Sinclair's gavel struck sharply. Overruled. Sit down, Mr. Tremont. Langston's composure crumbled under Angela's relentless questioning. He stammered through half-hearted denials, his answers increasingly inconsistent. The gallery watched in stunned silence as Angela dismantled his credibility piece by piece. By the time Angela returned to her seat, the plaintiff's case lay in ruins. Tremont sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the table, while Langston stared down at his lap, avoiding everyone's gaze. Judge Sinclair leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. He tapped his pen against the bench, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Tremont. Mr. Tremont, he said slowly, do you have any further evidence to support your client's claim? Tremont hesitated, his jaw tightening. No, Your Honor. Sinclair let out a heavy sigh, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He turned to Angela, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Miss Monroe, he said, his tone quieter now, your evidence is compelling, and your presentation leaves little doubt as to the truth. This court finds in favor of the defendant. The plaintiff's case is dismissed. The words hung in the air for a moment before the gallery erupted in murmurs. Angela exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. She glanced briefly at Tremont, who refused to meet her gaze, and then at Judge Sinclair, who watched her with a thoughtful expression. As the courtroom emptied, reporters crowded around Angela, their voices overlapping as they peppered her with questions. She answered calmly, her responses measured but firm, deflecting praise and focusing on the importance of justice. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Tremont and Langston faced the fallout. News of their defeat, coupled with whispers of fraud, spread quickly. By the end of the week, Langston's business dealings were under investigation, and Tremont's reputation was irreparably damaged. That evening, Angela returned to her small apartment on the south side of Chicago. She placed her worn briefcase on the kitchen table and sank into a chair, staring at the quiet space around her. The victory was hers, but it came with a bittersweet weight. Her father, Elijah Monroe, was no longer here to see her fight for his legacy. Still, she felt his presence in every step she had taken, every word she had spoken. She opened the folder containing his will, tracing her fingers over his signature. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. The next morning, Angela would rise and return to her quiet work, not as a defeated defendant, but as a woman who had proven her worth in a courtroom that had tried to dismiss her. The truth, she knew, was its own kind of victory, and she intended to keep fighting for it. The days following Angela Monroe's victory were a blur of quiet triumph and unexpected attention. For someone who had always preferred to work in the background, the sudden spotlight was both a surprise and a challenge. She returned to the Cook County Courthouse to complete paperwork formalizing her legal ownership of the property, her steps echoing down the marble corridors that now felt less intimidating. But beneath her outward composure, Angela carried a mixture of emotions: pride, relief, and a persistent ache of grief. The property was hers again, a place tied to her father's memory, a sanctuary they had once shared. Now it was also a testament to her own resilience. On her way out of the courthouse that morning, Angela was stopped by a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. "Miss Monroe." Angela turned slowly, her calm expression tightening ever so slightly. Judge Edward Sinclair stood a few feet away, his robes replaced with a crisp gray suit. He looked different outside the courtroom, less imperious, more human. "Your Honor," Angela replied politely, though her tone carried a subtle edge. "What can I do for you?" Sinclair hesitated, an unusual awkwardness in his stance. "I wanted to congratulate you on your win," he said finally. "You presented an extraordinary case." Angela raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I'm not sure I need congratulations from someone who doubted me at every turn." The judge winced, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Fair enough, he admitted. I made assumptions, and I owe you an apology for that. I underestimated you, and that was a mistake. Angela's posture softened slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. It wasn't just me you underestimated, she said. It was the law, the truth, and people like me who are more than what they seem. Sinclair nodded, his gaze steady. You're right, and I'll remember that. He extended his hand, a gesture of sincerity. For whatever it's worth, you've earned my respect. Angela regarded his outstretched hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her tone measured. I hope you'll carry that lesson into your courtroom. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Sinclair standing in the sunlight streaming through the courthouse's tall windows. He watched her go, a thoughtful expression on his face. Later that day, Angela drove to the property at the heart of the case. The modest brick house sat on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, their bare branches swaying in the winter breeze. The sight of it brought a wave of memories rushing back. Her father standing on the porch, his laugh echoing through the yard, the smell of fresh-cut grass in the summer. Angela parked her car and stepped out, the crisp air biting at her cheeks. She approached the front door slowly, her fingers brushing the faded wood. A flood of emotions threatened to overwhelm her, but she took a steadying breath and unlocked the door. Inside, the house was just as she remembered, simple, warm, and filled with remnants of her father's life. A faded armchair sat in the corner of the living room, a stack of old books resting beside it. The walls bore faint marks where family photos had once hung, and the air carried a faint trace of her father's favorite aftershave. Angela set her briefcase down on the kitchen table, running her fingers over its worn surface. She opened a drawer and found an old keychain her father used to carry, a small silver charm engraved with the initials EM. As she explored the house, Angela discovered a sealed envelope tucked away in a drawer in her father's study. Her name was written on the front in his familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it and unfolded the paper inside. Dear Angela, if you're reading this, it means the house is yours now. I hope it never came to a fight, but if it did, I know you stood your ground. You always were the strong one. This place isn't just a house. It's a piece of us. Every nail, every board, every brick holds a memory. Protect it, not just because it's yours, but because it reminds us of where we came from and how far we can go. And Angela, never forget, you're capable of more than anyone can imagine, including yourself. Keep fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm so proud of you always. Love, Dad. Tears slipped down Angela's cheeks as she read the words. She folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest, her heart heavy but full. In the days that followed, Angela began making plans to restore the house. It would take time and effort, but she was determined to honor her father's memory by preserving what he had built. She also reached out to local organizations, offering to use the space for community events and legal workshops. It's not just my home, Angela explained to a colleague over coffee one afternoon. It's a place where people can come to feel safe, to learn their rights, to know they're not alone. Her colleague smiled. You've turned a legal battle into something bigger. Your father would be proud. Angela nodded, her resolve firm. She wasn't just rebuilding a house, she was building a legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Angela stood on the porch of the house, watching the golden light fade into dusk. She held her father's keychain in her hand, the cool metal a comforting weight. This house had been the scene of her greatest fight, but it was also a symbol of everything she stood for: resilience, justice, and the power of truth. She had proven that even when the odds were stacked against her, she could rise. And she wasn't done yet. As the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Angela whispered softly, "We did it, Dad. And this is just the beginning." The wind rustled the branches of the oak trees, carrying her words into the night. And so, with the judge's gavel striking the final decision, Angela Monroe didn't just reclaim her family's legacy. She taught everyone in that courtroom a lesson they would never forget. The underestimated woman, the hidden genius, had turned the tables and proved that justice, when fought for with determination, can prevail against all odds. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, truth, and a stunning twist, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales that inspire and surprise. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, thank you for watching, and keep standing up for what's right.